Chapter 10 The Rockefeller Syndicate. Many American conservatives believe as a matter of faith that the Rockefellers and the Council on Foreign Relations exercise absolute control over the government and the people of United States. This thesis can be accepted as a working formula if one remains conscious of the larger issues. Two writers for whom the present writer has great respect, Dr. Emanuel Josephson and Maurice Beall, insisted on focusing on the Rockefellers and excluding all other aspects of the world order. This severely limited the effect of their otherwise groundbreaking work on the medical monopoly. This writer advanced a contrary view in The World Order, fixing upon the Rothschild monetary power, which reached a point of world control by 1885, and its London policy group, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, as the policy makers for what has essentially been since 1900, a re-established colonial government in the United States. The colonial, or occupation, government, functions primarily through the Council on Foreign Relations, but only as the subsidiary of RIIA and through the Rockefeller Foundation, which controls government functions, the educational establishments, the media, the religions and the state legislatures. It is true that the American colonials have free elections, in which they have the absolute right to vote for one of two opposing candidates, both of whom have been hand-picked and financed by the Rockefeller Syndicate. This touching evidence of democracy serves to convince most Americans that we are indeed a free people. We even have a cracked Liberty Bell in Philadelphia to prove it. American youths have been free since 1900 to be marched off to die in Hegelian wars in which both combatants received their instructions from the world order. We are free to invest in a stock market in which the daily quantity, price and value of the monetary unit is manipulated and controlled by a Federal Reserve System which is answerable only to the Bank of England. It has maintained its vaunted independence from our government control, but this is the only independence it has ever had. The realization that we do indeed live under the dictates of the Rockefeller Syndicate can well be the starting point of the long road back of a genuine struggle for American independence. In exposing the Rockefellers as agents of a foreign power, which is not merely a foreign power but a genuine world government, we must realize that this is not merely a group dedicated to making money, but a group which is committed to maintaining the power of a colonial form of government over the American people. Thus the ancient calumny of John D. Rockefeller as a man obsessed by greed, a category in which he has plenty of company, obscures the fact that from the day the Rothschilds began to finance his march towards a total oil monopoly in the United States from their coffers at the National City Bank of Cleveland, Rockefeller was never an independent power, nor does any department of the Rockefeller Syndicate operate as an independent power. We know that the Cosa Nostra, or Mafia, with which the syndicate is closely allied has somewhat autonomous power in the regions which have been assigned to that particular family by the national directors, but this always implies that that family remains under total control and answerable for everything which occurs in its territory. Similarly, the Rockefeller Syndicate operates under clearly defined spheres of influence. The charitable organizations, the business companies and the policy groups, always meld into a working operation, nor can any department of the syndicate strike out on its own or formulate an independent policy, no matter what may be its justification. The Rockefeller Syndicate operates under the control of the world financial structure, which means that on any given day, all of its assets could be rendered close to worthless by adroit financial manipulation. This the final control, which ensures that no one can quit the organization. Not only would he be stripped of all assets, but he would be under contract for immediate assassination. Our Department of Justice is well aware that the only terrorists operating in the United States are the agents of the world order, but they prudently avoid any mention of this fact. The world financial structure, far from being an unknown or hidden organization, is actually well known and well defined. It consists of the major Swiss banks, the survivors of the old Venetian Genoese banking axis, the Big Five of the world grain trade, the British Combine, centered in the Bank of England and its chartered merchant banks, functioning through the Rothschilds and the Oppenheimers and having absolute control over their Canadian colony through the Royal Bank of Canada and the Bank of Montreal, their Canadian lieutenants being the Bronfmans, Belzbergs, Reitmans and other financial operators, and the colonial banking structure in the United States, controlled controlled by the Bank of England through the Federal Reserve System, the Boston Brahmin families who made their fortunes in the opium trade, including the Delanos and others, and the Rockefeller Syndicate, consisting of the Kissinger Network headquartered in the Rockefeller Bank, Chase Manhattan Bank, American Express, the present form of the old Rothschild representatives in the United States, which includes Kuhn, Loeb Company and Lehman Brothers. It is notable that the Rockefeller Syndicate is far down on the list of the world's financial structure. Why then is it of such importance? Although it is not the crucial factor in financial decision in the Western Hemisphere, it is the actual working control mechanism of the American colony. The Rockefeller family themselves, like the Morgans, Schiffs and Warburgs, have faded into insignificance, but the mechanism created in their name roars along at full power, still maintaining all of the functions for which it was organized. Since he set up the Trilateral Commission, David Rockefeller has functioned as a sort of international courier for the world order, principally concerned with delivering working instructions to the communist bloc, either directly, in New York, or by traveling to the area. Lawrence Rockefeller is active in the operation of the medical monopoly, but his principal interests are in operating various vacation spas in tropical areas. They are the two survivors of the Fortunate Five, the five sons of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Abby Aldrich. John D. Rockefeller Jr. died in an institution in Tucson, Arizona, and was hastily cremated. John D. Rockefeller III died in a mysterious accident on a New York parkway near his home. Nelson Rockefeller, named after his grandfather, died in the arms of a TV journalist. It was later revealed that he had also been in the arms of another TV journalist at the same time. The death was hushed up for many hours. It is generally believed that he ran afoul of his Colombian drug connection, the disagreement hardly being trivial. It involved several $1 billion in drug profits which had not been properly apportioned. Winthrop Rockefeller died an alcoholic in the arms of his black boy friend. He had been interviewed on television by Harry Reasoner to explain his hasty move from New York to Arkansas. Winthrop leered that his black boy friend, an army sergeant who apparently taught him the mysteries of drill, refused to live in New York. To celebrate this alliance, Winthrop Rockefeller gave magnificently to Negro causes, including the Urban League building on East 48th Street in New York. A plaque on the second floor notes that it was his gift. It might well have stated, "From Hadrian to his Auntie Naus." We do not wish to imply that the Rockefellers no longer have influence, but that the major policy dictates of the Rockefeller Syndicate are handed down by other capos, of whom they continue to be a visible force. Through the person of David Rockefeller, the family is sometimes called the first family of the Soviet Union. Only he and Dr. Armand Hammer, the moving force behind USTEC, have permanent permission to land the private planes at the Moscow airport. Others would suffer the fate of Cal 007. David Rockefeller's most significant trip to the Soviet Union may have been the fateful day when he landed in Moscow, having been told to inform Khrushchev that he was through. The Russians are very health conscious, and a scientist had sent information to Khrushchev that the use of chemical fertilizers in the Soviet Union presented a threat to the people. Khrushchev then announced a major change in the Soviet farm policy, centering around a reduction in the use of chemicals. This was upsetting to the head of the world's chemical fertilizer trust, David Rockefeller, and he responded with a terse one-word command: out. Both the Rockefeller family fortune and the considerable portion set aside in the foundations of the Rockefeller Syndicate are effectively insulated against any type of government control. Fortune magazine noted August 4, 1986, that John D. Rockefeller Jr. had created trusts in 1934 which now amounted to some $2.3 billion. Another $200 million had been set aside for the Abby Rockefeller branch. The five sons had trusts which in 1986 amount to $2.1 billion. These trusts had originally amounted to only $50 million each, showing the increase in their assets as well as inflation during the ensuing half-century. Fortune estimated the 1986 total Rockefeller wealth as $3.5 billion, of which $900 million was in securities and real estate. They owned 45% of the Time Life building. Nelson Rockefeller's International Basic Economy Corporation had been sold to a British company in 1980. For years, the Rockefeller family had deliberately kept the rents low in its major holding, Rockefeller Center, a $1.6 billion investment yielding an annual return of 1%. This was a convenient maneuver for tax purposes. Rockefeller Center recently went public, issuing stock which was sold to public buyers. The Rockefellers are rumored to be liquidating their investments in the New York area, and reinvesting in the West, particularly in the area around Phoenix, Arizona. It is possible that they know something we don't. However much of the Rockefeller wealth may be attributed to old John D's rapacity and ruthlessness, its origins are indubitably based in his initial financing from the National City Bank of Cleveland, which was identified in congressional reports as one of the three Rothschild banks in the United States, and by his later acceptance of the guidance of Jacob Schiff of Kuhn, Loeb Company, who had been born in the Rothschild house in Frankfurt and was now the principal Rothschild representative but unknown as such to the public, in the United States. With the seed money from the National City Bank of Cleveland, old John D. Rockefeller soon laid claim to the title of the most ruthless American. It is more than likely that it was this quality which persuaded the Rothschilds to back him. Rockefeller realized early in the game that the oil refinery business, which could offer great profits in a short time, also was at the mercy of uncontrolled competition. His solution was a simple one: crush all competition. The famous Rockefeller dedication to total monopoly was simply a business decision. Rockefeller embarked on a campaign of coercing all competing oil refineries out of business. He attacked on a number of fronts, which is also a lesson to all would-be entrepreneurs. First, he would send a minion, not known to be working for Rockefeller, with an offer to buy the competing refinery for a low price, but offering cash. If the offer was refused, the competitor would then come under attack from a competing refinery which greatly undercut his price. He might also suffer a sudden strike at his refinery, which would force him to shut down. Control of labor through unions has always been a basic Rockefeller technique. Like the Soviet Union, they seldom have labor trouble. If these techniques failed, Rockefeller would then be saddened by a reluctant decision to use violence, beating the rival workers as they went to and from their jobs, or burning or blowing up the competing refinery. These techniques convinced the Rothschilds that they had found their man. They sent their personal representative, Jacob Schiff, to Cleveland to help Rockefeller plan further expansion. At this time, the Rothschilds controlled 95% of all railroad mileage in the United States, through the J.P. Morgan Company and Kuhn Loeb Company, according to official Department of Commerce figures for the year 1895. J.P. Morgan mentions in his Who's Who listing that he controlled 50,000 miles of U.S. railways. Schiff worked out an elaborate rebate deal for Rockefeller, through a dummy corporation, South Improvement Company. These rebates ensured that no other oil company could survive in competition with the Rockefeller firm. The scheme was later exposed, but by that time, Rockefeller had achieved a virtual monopoly of the oil business in the United States. The daughter of one of his victims, Ida Tarbell, whose father was ruined by Rockefeller's criminal operations, wrote the first major exposé of the Standard Oil Trust. She was promptly denounced as a muckraker by the poseur, Theodore Roosevelt, who claimed to be a trustbuster. In fact, he ensured the dominance of the Standard Oil Trust and other giant trusts. During the next half-century, John D. Rockefeller was routinely caricatured by socialist propagandists as the epitome of the ruthless capitalist. At the same time, he was the principal financier of the world communist movement, through a firm called American International Company. Despite the fact that the House of Rothschild had already achieved world control, the sound and fury was directed exclusively against its two principal representatives, John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. One of the few revelations of the actual state of affairs appeared in Truth magazine, December 16, 1912, which pointed out that Mr. Schiff is head of the great private banking house of Kuhn, Loeb Company, which represents the Rothschild interests on this side of the Atlantic. He is described as a financial strategist and has been for years the financial minister of the great impersonal power known as Standard Oil. Note that this editor did not even mention the name of Rockefeller. Because of these concealed factors, it was a relatively simple matter for the American public to accept the fact that the Rockefellers were the preeminent power in this country. This myth was actually clothed in the apparel of power, the Rockefeller Oil Trust becoming the military-industrial complex, which assumed political control of the nation, the Rockefeller medical monopoly attained control of the health care of the nation, and the Rockefeller Foundation, a web of affiliated tax-exempt creations, effectively controlled the religious and educational life of the nation. The myth succeeded in its goal of camouflaging the hidden rulers, the Rothschilds. After the present writer had been exposing this charade for some 25 years, a new myth began to be noised about in American conservative circles, effectively propagated by active double agents. This myth found a host of eager believers, because it heralded a growing crack in the monolithic power which had been oppressing all the peoples of the world. This new revelation was that a struggle to the death for world power had developed between the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. According to this startling development, one faction or the other, depending on which agent you were listening to, had gained control of the Soviet Union and would use its power as the basis for achieving the overthrow of the other action. The sudden death of several members of the Rockefeller family was cited as proof that such a struggle was taking place, although no Rothschild is known to have succumbed during this war. This ignored the general understanding that Nelson Rockefeller had been eliminated as the result of losing deposit slips for several $1 billion of drugs from the Colombian cartel, or that the other Rockefeller deaths showed no trace of a Rothschild connection. Having maintained extensive files on this situation for several decades, the present writer could not believe anyone could be so misinformed as to think that the Rockefellers were now trying to seize power from the Rothschilds, at a time when the influence of members of the Rockefeller family was already in great decline, their family finances being handled by J. Richardson Dilworth, their legal affairs being handled by John J. McCloy, and other faithful retainers. None of these retainers would have been willing to engage in a genuine power struggle, as they were faceless managers who lived only for their weekly paycheck. They had no ambitions of their own. Nevertheless, many hopeful Americans grasped at the will-o'-the-wisp notion that the Rockefellers were now good Americans, who were willing to risk all to overthrow the Rothschilds. Amazingly enough, this pernicious story persisted for almost a decade before being relegated to the curiosities of history. Like J.P. Morgan, who had begun his commercial career by selling the U.S. Army some defective guns, the famous Hall carbine affair, John D. Rockefeller also was a war profiteer during the Civil War. He sold unstamped Harkness liquor to federal troops at a high profit, gaining the initial capital to embark on his drive for monopoly. His interest in the oil business was a natural one. His father, William Rockefeller, had been in oil for years. William Rockefeller had become an oil entrepreneur after salt wells at Tarentum, near Pittsburgh, were discovered in 1842 to be flowing with oil. The owners of the wells, Samuel L. Keir, began to bottle the oil and sell it for medicinal purposes. One of his earliest wholesalers was William Rockefeller. The medicine was originally labeled Keir's Magic Oil. Rockefeller printed his own labels, using rock oil or Seneca oil, Seneca being the name of a well-known Indian tribe. Rockefeller achieved his greatest notoriety and his greatest profits by advertising himself as William Rockefeller, the celebrated cancer specialist. It is understandable that his grandsons would become the controlling power behind the scenes of the world's most famous cancer treatment center and would direct government funds and charitable contributions to those areas which only benefit the medical monopoly. William Rockefeller spared no claim in his flamboyant career. He guaranteed all cases of cancer cured unless they are too far gone. Such were the healing powers that he attributed to his magic cancer cure that he was able to retail it for $25 a bottle, a sum then equivalent to 2 months' wages. The cure consisted of a few well-known diuretics, which had been diluted by water. This carnival medicine showbarker could hardly have envisioned that his descendants would control the greatest and the most profitable medical monopoly in recorded history. As an itinerant carny, a traveling carnival peddler, William Rockefeller had chosen a career which interfered with developing a stable family life. His son John rarely saw him, a circumstance which has inspired some psychological analysts to conjecture that the absence of a father figure or parental love may have contributed to John D. Rockefeller's subsequent development as a money-mad tyrant who plotted to maim, poison and kill millions of his fellow Americans during almost a century of his monopolistic operations and whose influence, reaching up from the grave, remains the most dire and malignant presence in American life. This may have been a contributing factor, however, it is also possible that he was totally evil. It is hardly arguable that he is probably the most satanic figure in American history. It has long been a truism that you can find a horse thief or two in any prominent American family. In the Rockefeller family, it was more than a truism. William seems to have faithfully followed the precepts of the Will of Canaan throughout his career: love robbery, love lechery. He fled from a number of indictments for horse stealing, finally disappearing altogether as William Rockefeller and re-emerging as a Dr. William Livingston of Philadelphia, a name which he retained for the rest of his life. An investigative reporter at Joseph Pulitzer's New York World received a tip that was followed up. The World then disclosed that William Avery Rockefeller had died May 11, 1906 in Freeport, Illinois, where he was interred in an unmarked grave as Dr. William Livingston. William Rockefeller's vocation as a medicine man greatly facilitated his preferred profession of horse thief. As one who planned to be in the next county by morning, it was a simple matter to tie a handsome stallion to the back of his wagon and head for the open road. It also played a large part in his vocation as a woman chaser. He was described as being woman mad. He not only concluded several bigamous marriages, but he seems to have had uncontrolled passions. On June 28, 1849, he was indicted for raping a hired girl in Cayuga, New York. He later was found to be residing in Oswego, New York, and was forced once again to decamp for parts unknown. He had no difficulty in financing his woman-chasing interests from the sale of his miraculous cancer cure and from another product, his wonder-working liniment, which he offered at only $2 a bottle. It consisted of crude petroleum from which the lighter oils had been boiled away, leaving a heavy solution of paraffin, lube oil and tar, which comprised the liniment. William Rockefeller's original miracle oil survived until quite recently as a concoction called Najol, consisting principally of petroleum and peddled as a laxative. It was well known that Najol was merely an advertising sobriquet meaning new oil, as opposed, apparently, to old oil, sold as an antidote to constipation. It robbed the body of fat-soluble vitamins, it being a well-established medical fact that mineral oil coated the intestine and prevented the absorption of many needed vitamins and other nutritional needs. Its makers added carotene as a sop to the health-conscious, but it was hardly worth the bother. Najol was manufactured by a subsidiary of Standard Oil of New Jersey, called Stanco, whose only other product, manufactured on the same premises, was the famous insecticide, Flit. Najol was hawked from the Senate Office Building in Washington for years during a more liberal interpretation of conflict of interest. In this case, it was hardly a conflict of interest, because the august peddler, Senator Royal S. Copeland, never had any interests other than serving the Rockefellers. He was a physician whom Rockefeller had appointed as head of the New York State Department of Health and later financed his campaign for the Senate. Copeland's frank display of commercialism amazed even the most blasé Washington reporters. He devoted his Senate career to a daily program advertising Najol. A microphone was set up in his Senate office each morning, the first order of business being the Najol program, for which he was paid $75,000 a year, an enormous salary in the 1930s and more than the salary of the President of the United States. Senator Copeland's exploits earned him a number of nicknames on Capitol Hill. He was often called the Senator from the American Medical Association, because of his enthusiastic backing for any program launched by the Armour and Morris Fishbein. More realistically, he was usually referred to as the Senator from Standard Oil. He could be counted on to promote any legislation devised for the greater profit of the Rockefeller monopoly. During congressional debate on the Food and Drug Act in 1938, he came under criticism from Congresswoman Leonore Sullivan, who charged that Senator Copeland, a physician who handled the bill on the Senate floor, frankly acknowledged during the debate that soap was exempted from the law, because the soap manufacturers, who were the nation's largest advertisers, would otherwise join with other big industries to fight the bill. Congressman Sullivan complained the soap was officially declared in the law not to be a cosmetic. The hair dye manufacturers were given a license to market known dangerous products, just so long as they placed a special warning on the label, but what woman in a beauty parlor ever sees the label on the bulk container in which hair dye is shipped? Just as the elder Rockefeller had spent his life in the pursuit of his personal obsession, women, so his son John was equally obsessed, being money-mad instead of women-mad, totally committed to the pursuit of ever-increasing wealth and power. However, the principal accomplishments of the Rockefeller drive for power, the rebate scheme for monopoly, the chartering of the foundations to gain power over American citizens, the creation of the central bank, the Federal Reserve System, the backing of the World Communist Revolution and the creation of the medical monopoly, all came from the Rothschilds or from their European employees. We cannot find in the records of John D. Rockefeller that he originated any one of these programs. The concept of the tax-exempt charitable foundation originated with the Rothschild minion, George Peabody, in 1865. The Peabody Educational Foundation later became the Rockefeller Foundation. It is unlikely that even the diabolical mind of John D. Rockefeller could have conceived of this devious twist. A social historian has described the major development of the late 19th century, when charitable foundations and world communism became important movements, as one of the more interesting facets of history, perhaps equivalent to the discovery of the wheel. This new discovery was the concept developed by the rats, who after all have rather highly developed intelligences, that they could trap people by baiting traps with little bits of cheese. The history of mankind since then has been the rats catching humans in their traps. Socialism, indeed, any government program, is simply the rat baiting the trap with a smidgen of cheese and catching himself a human. Congressman Wright Putman, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, noted from the floor of Congress that the establishment of the Rockefeller Foundation effectively insulated Standard Oil from competition. The controlling stock had been removed from market manipulation or possible buyouts by competitors. It also relieved Standard Oil from most taxation, which then placed a tremendous added burden on individual American taxpayers. Although a Rockefeller relative by marriage, Senator Nelson Aldrich, Republican Majority Leader in the Senate, had pushed the General Education Board charter through Congress, the Rockefeller Foundation charter proved to be more difficult. Widespread criticism of Rockefeller's monopolistic practices was heard, and his effort to insulate his profits from taxation or takeover was seen for what it was. The charter was finally pushed through in 1913. The significant Masonic numeral 13, 1913 was also the year of the progressive income tax and of the enactment of the Federal Reserve Act. Senator Robert F. Wagner of New York, another senator from Standard Oil, there were quite a few, ramrodded the congressional approval of the charter. The charter was then signed by John D. Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller Jr., Henry Pratt Judson, president of the Rockefeller-established University of Chicago, Simon Flexner, director of the Rockefeller Institute, Star Jameson, described in Who's Who as personal counsel to John D. Rockefeller in his benevolences, and Charles W. Eliot, president of Harvard University. The Rockefeller oil monopoly is now 125 years old, yet in 1911, the Supreme Court, bowing to public outrage, had ruled that it had to be broken up. The resulting companies proved to be no problem for the Rockefeller interests. The family retained a 2% holding in each of the new companies, while the Rockefeller Foundations took a 3% stock holding in each company. This gave them a 5% stock interest in each company. A 1% holding in a corporation is usually sufficient to maintain working control. The involvement of the Rockefellers in promoting the world communist revolution also developed from their business interests. There was never any commitment to the Marxist ideology. Like anything else, it was there to be used. At the turn of the century, Standard Oil was competing fiercely with Royal Dutch Shell for control of the lucrative European market. Congressional testimony revealed that Rockefeller had sent large sums to Lenin and Trotsky to instigate the Communist Revolution of 1905. His banker, Jacob Schiff, had previously financed the Japanese in their war against Russia and had sent a personal emissary, George Kennan, to Russia to spend some 20 years in promoting revolutionary activity against the Tsar. When the 1905 revolution failed, Lenin was placed in storage in Switzerland until 1917. Trotsky was brought to the United States, where he lived rent-free on the Standard Oil property at Bayonne, New Jersey, its tank field. When the Tsar abdicated, Trotsky was placed on a ship with 300 communist revolutionaries from the Lower East Side of New York. Rockefeller obtained a special passport for Trotsky from Woodrow Wilson and sent Lincoln Steffens with him to make sure he was returned safely to Russia. For traveling expenses, Rockefeller placed a purse containing $10,000 in Trotsky's pocket. On April 13, 1917, when the ship stopped in Halifax, Canadian Secret Service officers immediately arrested Trotsky and interred him in Nova Scotia. The case became an international cause célèbre, as leading government officials from several nations frantically demanded Trotsky's release. The Secret Service had been tipped off that Trotsky was on his way to take Russia out of the war, freeing more German armies to attack Canadian troops on the Western Front. Prime Minister Lloyd George hurriedly cabled orders from London to the Canadian Secret Service to free Trotsky at once. They ignored him. Trotsky was finally freed by the intervention of one of Rockefeller's most faithful stooges, Canadian Minister Mackenzie King, who had long been a labor specialist for the Rockefellers. King personally obtained Trotsky's release and sent him on his way as the emissary of the Rockefellers, commissioned to win the Bolshevik Revolution. Thus Dr. Armand Hammer, who loudly proclaims his influence in Russia as the friend of Lenin, has an insignificant claim compared to the role of the Rockefellers in backing world communism. Although communism, like other ISMS, had originated with Marx's association with the House of Rothschild, it enlisted the reverent support of John D. Rockefeller because he saw communism for what it is, the ultimate monopoly, not only controlling the government, the monetary system and all property, but also a monopoly which, like the corporations it emulates, is self-perpetuating and eternal. It was the logical progression from his Standard Oil monopoly. An important step on the road to world monopoly was the most far-reaching corporation invented by the Rothschilds. This was the International Drug and Chemical Cartel, IG Farben. Called a state within a state, it was created in 1925 as Interessengemeinschaft Farbeindustrie Aktiengesellschaft, usually known as IG Farben, which simply meant the cartel. It had originated in 1904, when the 6 major chemical companies in Germany began negotiations to form the ultimate cartel, merging Badischer Anilin, Bayer, Agfa, Hochst, Violeter Meer, and Greisheim Elektron. The guiding spirit, as well as the financing, came from the Rothschilds, who were represented by the German banker, Max Warburg, of Warburg Company, Hamburg. He later headed the German Secret Service during World War I and was personal financial advisor to the Kaiser. When the Kaiser was overthrown, after losing the war, Max Warburg was not exiled with him to Holland. Instead, he became the financial advisor to the new government. Monarchs may come and go, but the real power remains with the bankers. While representing Germany at the Paris Peace Conference, Max Warburg spent pleasant hours renewing family ties with his brother, Paul Warburg, who, after drafting the Federal Reserve Act at Jekyll Island, had headed the U.S. banking system during the war. He was in Paris as Woodrow Wilson's financial advisor. IG Farben soon had a net worth of 6 billion marks, controlling some 500 firms. Its first president was Professor Karl Bosch. During the period of the Weimar Republic, IG officials, seeing the handwriting on the wall, began a close association with Adolf Hitler, supplying much-needed funds and political influence. The success of the IG Farben cartel had aroused the interest of other industrialists. Henry Ford was favorably impressed and set up a German branch of Ford Motor Company. 40% of the stock was purchased by IG Farben. IG Farben then established an American subsidiary, called American IG, in cooperation with Standard Oil of New Jersey. Its directors included Walter Teagle, president of Standard Oil, Paul Warburg of Kuhn, Loeb Company and Edsel Ford, representing the Ford interests. John Foster Dulles, for the law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, became the attorney for IG, frequently traveling between New York and Berlin on cartel business. His law partner, Arthur Dean, is now director of the $40 million Teagle Foundation, which was set up before Teagle's death. Like other fortunes, it had become part of the network. Like John Foster Dulles, Arthur Dean has been a director of American Banknote for many years. This is the firm which supplies the paper for our dollar bills. Dean also has been an active behind-the-scenes government negotiator, serving as arms negotiator at disarmament on conferences. Dean was also a director of Rockefeller's American Ag and Chem Company. He was a director of American Solvay, American Metal and other firms. As attorney for the wealthy Hochschild family, who owned Climax Molybdenum and American Metal, Dean became director of their family foundation, the Hochschild Foundation. Dean is Director Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Asia Foundation, International House, Carnegie Foundation, and the Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. In 1930, Standard Oil announced that it had purchased an alcohol monopoly in Germany, a deal which had been set up by I.G. Farben. After Hitler came to power, John D. Rockefeller assigned his personal press agent, Ivy Lee, to Hitler to serve as a full-time advisor on the rearmament of Germany, a necessary step for setting up World War I. Standard Oil then built large refineries in Germany for the Nazis and continued to supply them with oil during World War II. In the 1930s, Standard Oil was receiving in payment from Germany large shipments of musical instruments and ships which had been built in German yards. The dreaded Gestapo, the Nazi police force, was actually built from the worldwide intelligence network which I.G. Farben had maintained since its inception. Hermann Schmitz, who had succeeded Karl Bosch as head of IG, has been personal advisor to Chancellor Brüning. When Hitler took over, Schmitz then became his most trusted secret counselor. So well concealed was the association that the press had orders never to photograph them together. Schmitz was named an honorary member of the Reichstag, while his assistant, Karl Krausch, became Göring's principal advisor in carrying out the Nazis' four-year plan. A business associate, Richard Krebs, later testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee. The I.G. Farben industry, I know from personal experience, was already, in 1934, completely in the hands of the Gestapo. This was a misstatement. The I.G. Farben had merely allied itself with the Gestapo. In 1924, Krupp Industries was in serious financial difficulty. The firm was saved by a $10 million cash loan from Hallgarten and Company and Goldman Sachs, two of Wall Street's best-known firms. The planned rearmament of Germany was able to proceed only after Dillon Read floated $100 million of German bonds on Wall Street for that purpose. It was hardly surprising that at the conclusion of the Second World War, General William Draper was appointed Economic Czar of Germany, being named head of the economic division of the Allied military government. He was a partner of Dillon Read. In 1939, Frank Howard, a vice president of Standard Oil, visited Germany. He later testified, "We did our best to work out complete plans for a modus vivendi which would operate throughout the term of the war, whether we came in or not." At this time, American IG had on its board of directors Charles Mitchell. President of the National City Bank, the Rockefeller Bank, Karl Bosch, Paul Warburg, Hermann Schmitz and Schmitz's nephew, Max Ilbner. Although his name is hardly known, Frank Howard was for many years a key figure in Standard Oil operations as director of its research and its international agreements. He also was chairman of the research committee at Sloan Kettering Institute during the 1930s. His appointee at Sloan Kettering, Dusty Rhodes, headed the experimentation in the development of chemotherapy. During the Second World War, Rhodes headed the Chemical Warfare Service in Washington at U.S. Army headquarters. It was Frank Howard who had persuaded both Alfred Sloan and Charles Kettering of General Motors in 1939 to give the fortunes to the Cancer Center, which then took on their names. A member of the wealthy Atherton family, Frank Howard (1890–1964), had married a second time, his second wife being a leading member of the British aristocracy, the Duchess of Leeds. The first Duke of Leeds was titled in 1694, Sir Thomas Osborne, who was one of the key conspirators in the overthrow of King James II and the seizure of the throne of England by William III in 1688. Osborne had made peace with Holland during the reign of King Charles II, and single-handedly promoted the marriage of Mary, daughter of the Duke of York, to William of Orange in 1677. The Dictionary of National Biography notes that Osborne, for 5 years, managed the House of Commons by corruption and enriched himself. He was impeached by King Charles II for treasonous negotiations with King Louis XIV and imprisoned in the Tower of London from 1678 to 1684. After his release, he again became active in the conspiracy to bring in William of Orange as King of England and secured the crucial province of York for him. William then created him Duke of Leeds. The placing of William on the throne of England made it possible for the conspirators to implement the crucial step in their plans, setting up the Bank of England in 1694. This enabled the Amsterdam bankers to gain control of the wealth of the British Empire. Osborne's biography also notes that he was later accused of Jacobinite intrigues and was impeached for receiving a large bribe to procure the charter for the East India Company in 1695, but the proceedings were not concluded. It was further noted that he left a large fortune. The 1th Duke of Leeds was minister to Washington from 1931 to 1935, minister to the Holy See from 1936 to 1947, that is, throughout the Second World War. One branch of the family married into the Delano family, becoming relatives of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. A cousin, Viscount Chandos, was a prominent British official, serving in the War Cabinet under Churchill from 1942 to 1945, later becoming a director of the Rothschild firm, Alliance Assurance, and Imperial Chemical Industries. Frank Howard was the key official in maintaining relations between Standard Oil and IG Farben. He led in the development of synthetic rubber, which was crucial to Germany in the Second World War. He later wrote a book, Buna Rubber. He also was the consultant to the drug firm, Rohm and Haas, representing the Rockefeller connection with that firm. In his later years, he resided in Paris, but continued to maintain his office at 30 Rockefeller Center, New York. Walter Teagle, the president of Standard Oil, owned 500,000 shares of American IG, these shares later becoming the basis of the Teagle Foundation. Herman Metz, who was also a director of American IG, was president of H.A. Metz Company, New York, a drug firm wholly owned by IG Farben of Germany. Francis Garvan, who had served as alien property custodian during the First World War, knew many secrets of IG Farben's operations. He was prosecuted in 1929 to force him to remain silent. The action was brought by the Department of Justice through Attorney General Merton Lewis, the former counsel for Bosch Company. John Krim, former counsel for the German embassy in the United States, testified that Senator John King had been on the payroll of the Hamburg American Line for 3 years at a salary of $15,000 a year. He appointed Otto Kahn as treasurer of his election fund. Homer Cummings, who had been Attorney General for 6 years, then became counsel for General Anilin and Film at a salary of $100,000 a year. During the Second World War, GAF was supposedly owned by a Swiss firm. It came under considerable suspicion as an enemy concern and was finally taken over by the United States government. John Foster Dulles had been director of GAF from 1927 to 1934. He was also a director of International Nickel, which was part of the network of IG Farben firms. Dulles was related to the Rockefeller family through the Avery connection. He was attorney for the organization of a new investment firm, set up by Avery Rockefeller, in 1936 which was called Schroeder Rockefeller Company. It combined operations of the Schroeder Bank, Hitler's personal bank and the Rockefeller interests. Baron Kurt van Schroeder was one of Hitler's closest confidants, and a leading officer of the SS. He was head of the Kepler Associates, which funneled money to the SS for leading German corporations. Kepler was the official in charge of industrial fats during Göring's 4-year plan, which was launched in 1936. American IG changed its name to General Anilin and Film during the Second World War, but it was still wholly owned by IG Chemie of Switzerland, a subsidiary of IG Farben of Germany. It was headed by Gadot, brother-in-law of Hermann Schmitz. IG Farben's international agreements directly affected the U.S. war effort, because they set limits on U.S. supplies of magnesium, synthetic rubber and crucial medical supplies. The director of IG Farben's dyestuffs division, Baron George von Schnitzler, was related to the powerful von Rath family, the J. H. Stein Bankhaus which held Hitler's account, and the von Mallinckrodt family, the founders of the drug firm in the United States. Like other IG officials, he had become an enthusiastic supporter of the Hitler regime. IG Farben gave 4.5 million Reichsmarks to the Nazi Party in 1933. By 1945, IG had given the party 40 million Reichsmarks, a sum which equaled all contributions by IG to all other recipients during that period. One scholar of the Nazi era, Anthony Sutton, has focused heavily on German supporters of Hitler, while ignoring the crucial role played by the Bank of England and its governor, Sir Montague Norman, in financing the Nazi regime. Sutton's position on this problem may have been influenced by the fact that he is British. In view of the outspoken statements from Adolf Hitler about Jewish influence in Germany, it would be difficult to explain the role of IG Farben in the Nazi era. Peter Hayes' definitive study of IG Farben shows that in 1933, it had 10 Jews on its governing boards. We have previously pointed out that IG, from its inception, was a Rothschild concern, formulated by the House of Rothschild and implemented through its agents, Max Warburg in Germany and Standard Oil in the United States. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands joined the SS during the early 1930s. He then joined the board of an IG subsidiary, Farben Bilder, from which he took the name of his post-war super-secret policy-making group, the Bilderbergers. Farben executives played an important role in organizing the Circle of Friends for Heinrich Himmler, although it was initially known as Kepler's Circle of Friends, Kepler being the chairman of an IG subsidiary. His nephew, Fritz J. Kranefuss, was the personal assistant to Heinrich Himmler. Of the 40 members of the Circle of Friends, which provided ample funds for Himmler, 8 were executives of IG Farben or of its subsidiaries. Despite the incredible devastation of most German cities from World War II air bombings, the IG Farben building in Frankfurt, one of the largest buildings there, miraculously survived intact. A large Rockefeller mansion in Frankfurt also was left untouched by the war, despite the saturation bombing. Frankfurt was the birthplace of the Rothschild family. It was hardly coincidental that the post-war government of Germany, Allied military government, should set up its offices in the magnificent IG Farben building. This government was headed by General Lucius Clay, who later became a partner of Lehman Brothers bankers in New York. The political division was headed by Robert Murphy, who would preside at the Nuremberg trials, where he was successful in glossing over the implication of IG Farben officials and Baron Kurt von Schroeder. Schroeder was held a short time in a detention camp and then set free to return to his banking business. The economic division was headed by Lewis Douglas, son of the founder of Memorial Cancer Center in New York, president of Mutual Life and director of General Motors. Douglas was slated to become U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, but he agreed to step aside in favor of his brother-in-law, John J. McCloy. By an interesting circumstance, Douglas, McCloy and Chancellor Konrad Adenauer of Germany had all married sisters, the daughters of John Zinsser, a partner of J.P. Morgan Company. As the world's preeminent cartel, IG Farben and the drug companies which it controlled in the United States through the Rockefeller interests were responsible for many inexplicable developments in the production and distribution of drugs. From 1908 to 1936, IG held back its discovery of sulfanilamide, which would become a potent weapon in the medical arsenal. In 1920, IG had signed working agreements with the important drug firms of Switzerland, Sandoz and Seeberg IG. In 1926, IG merged with Dynamit Nobel, the German branch of the dynamite firm, while an English firm took over the English division. IG officials then began to negotiate with Standard Oil officials about the prospective manufacture of synthetic coal, which would present a serious threat to Standard Oil's monopoly. A compromise was reached with the establishment of American IG, in which both firms would play an active role and share in the profits. Charles Hyam's book, Trading with the Enemy, offers ample documentation of the Rockefeller activities during the Second World War. While Hitler's bombers were dropping tons of explosives on London, they were paying royalties on every gallon of gasoline they burned to Standard Oil, under existing patent agreements. After World War II, when Queen Elizabeth visited the United States, she stayed in only one private home during her visit, the Kentucky estate of William Farish, of Standard Oil. Nelson Rockefeller moved to Washington after our involvement in World War II, where Roosevelt named him coordinator of inter-American affairs. Apparently his principal task was to coordinate the refueling of German ships in South America from Standard Oil tanks. He also used this office to obtain important South American concessions for his private firm, International Basic Exonomy Corporation, including a corner on the Colombian coffee market. He promptly upped the price, a move which enabled him to buy $7 billion worth of real estate in South America and also gave rise to the stereotype of the Yankee imperialismo. The attack on Vice President Nixon's automobile when he visited South America was explained by American officials as a direct result of the depredations of the Rockefellers, which caused widespread agitation against Americans in Latin America. After World War II, 24 German executives were prosecuted by the victors, all of them connected with IG Farben, including 11 officers of IG-8 were acquitted, including Max Ildner, nephew of Harman Schmitz. Schmitz received the most severe sentence, 8 years. Ildner actually received 3 years, but the time was credited against his time in jail waiting for trial, and he was immediately released. The judge was C.G. Sheikh and the prosecuting attorney was Al Minskoff. The survival of IG Farben was headlined by the Wall Street Journal on May 3, 1988, Germany beats world in chemical sales. Reporter Thomas F. O'Boyle listed the world's top 5 chemical companies in 1987 as 1. BASF $25.8 billion, 2. Bayer $23.6 billion, 3. Hotchkiss $23.50 billion, 4. ICI $20 billion, 5. DuPont $17 billion in chemical sales only. The first 3 companies are the firms resulting from the dismantling of IG Farben from 1945 to 1952 by the Allied military government, in a process suspiciously similar to the dismantling of the Standard Oil Empire by court edict in 1911. The total sales computed in dollars of the 3 spin-offs of IG Farben, some $72 billion, dwarfs its nearest rivals, ICI and DuPont, who together amount to about half of the Farben Empire's dollar sales in 1987. Hotchkiss bought Celanese Corp. in 1987 for $2.72 billion. O'Boyle notes that the Big Three Farben spin-offs still behave like a cartel. Each dominates specific areas, head-to-head competition is limited. Critics suspect collusion. At the least, there's a coziness that doesn't exist in the U.S. chemical industry. After the war, Americans were told they must support an altruistic plan to rebuild devastated Europe, to be called the Marshall Plan, after Chief of Staff George Marshall, who had been labeled on the floor of the Senate by Senator Joseph McCarthy as a living lie. The Marshall Plan proved to be merely another Rockefeller plan to loot the American taxpayer. On December 13, 1948, Colonel Robert McCormick, editor of the Chicago Tribune, personally denounced Esso's looting of the Marshall Plan in a signed editorial. The Marshall Plan had been rushed through Congress by a powerful and vocal group, headed by Winthrop Aldrich, president of the Chase Manhattan Bank and Nelson Rockefeller's brother-in-law, ably seconded by Nelson Rockefeller and William Clayton, the head of Anderson, Clayton Company. The Marshall Plan proved to be but one of a number of lucrative post-war swindles, which included the Bretton Woods Agreement, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation and others. After World War II, the Rockefellers used their war profits to buy a large share of Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, an African copper lode owned by Belgian interest, including the Société Générale, a Jesuit-controlled bank. Soon after their investment, the Rockefellers launched a bold attempt to seize total control of the mines through sponsoring a local revolution, using as their agent the Grangersburg operation. This enterprise had originally been developed by Sir Ernest Cassel, financial advisor to King Edward VII. Cassel's daughter later married Lord Mountbatten, a member of the British royal family, who was also related to the Rothschilds. Grangersburg was now headed by Beau Hammarskjöld, whose brother, Dag Hammarskjöld, was then Secretary-General of the United Nations. Beau Hammarskjöld became a casualty of the Rockefeller Revolution when his plane was shot down during hostilities in the Congo. Various stories have since circulated about who killed him and why he was killed. The Rockefeller intervention in the Congo was carried out by their able lieutenants, Dean Rusk and George Ball of the State Department, and by Fowler Hamilton. In the United States, the Rockefeller interests continue to play the major political role. Old John D. Rockefeller's treasurer at Standard Oil, Charles Pratt, bequeathed his New York mansion to the Council on Foreign Relations as its world headquarters. His grandson, George Pratt Schultz, is now Secretary of State. The Rockefellers also wielded a crucial role through the financing of the Trotskyite communist group in the United States, the League for Industrial Democracy, whose directors include such staunch anti-communists as Jeane Kirkpatrick and Sidney Hook. The Rockefellers were also active on the right-wing front through the sponsorship of the John Birch Society. To enable Robert Welch, a 32nd-degree Mason, to devote all of his time to the John Birch Society, Nelson Rockefeller purchased his family firm, the Welch Candy Company, from him at a handsome price. Welch chose the principal officers of the John Birch Society from his acquaintances at the Council on Foreign Relations. For years afterwards, American patriots were puzzled by the consistent inability of the John Birch Society to move forward on any of its well-advertised, anti-communist goals. The fact that the society had been set up at the behest of the backers of the World Communist Revolution may have played some role in this development. Other patriots wondered why most American conservative writers, including the present writer, were steadily blacklisted by the John Birch Society for some 30 years. Despite thousands of requests from would-be book buyers, the John Birch Society refused to review or list any of my books. After several decades of futility, the society was totally discredited by its own record. In a desperate effort to restore its image, William Buckley, the CIA propagandist, launched a fierce attack against the John Birch Society in the pages of his magazine, The National Review. This free publicity campaign also did little to revive the moribund organization. The Rockefeller monopoly influence has had its effect on some of New York's largest and wealthiest churches. Trinity Church on Wall Street, whose financial resources had been directed by none other than J.P. Morgan, owns some 40 commercial properties in Manhattan and has a stock portfolio of $50 million, which, due to informed investment, actually yields a return of $25 million a year. Only $2.6 million of this income is spent for charitable work. The rector, who receives a salary of $100,000 a year, lives on the fashionable Upper East Side. Trinity's mausoleum sells its spaces at fees started at $1,250 and rising to $20,000. St. Bartholomew's, on Fifth Avenue, has an annual budget of $3.2 million a year, of which only $100,000 is spent on charity. Its rector resides in a 13-room apartment on Park Avenue. In medicine, the Rockefeller influence remains entrenched in its medical monopoly. We have mentioned its control of the cancer industry through the Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. We have listed the directors of the major drug firms, each with its director from Chase Manhattan Bank, the Standard Oil Company, or other Rockefeller firms. The American College of Surgeons maintains a monopolistic control of hospitals through the powerful Hospital Survey Committee, with members Winthrop Aldrich and David McAlpine Pyle representing the Rockefeller control. A medical fraternity known as the Rich Man's Club, the New York Academy of Medicine, was offered grants for a new building by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation, its subsidiary group. This seed money was then used to finance a public campaign which brought in funds to erect a new building. For director of the new facility, the Rockefellers chose Dr. Lindsley Williams, son-in-law of the managing partner of Kidder, Peabody, a firm strongly affiliated with the J.P. Morgan interests. The J.P. Morgan Company had originally been called the Peabody Company. Williams was married to Grace Kidder Ford. Although Dr. Williams was widely known to be an incompetent physician, his family connections were impeccable. He became a factor in Franklin D. Roosevelt's election campaign when he publicly certified that Roosevelt, a cripple in a wheelchair who suffered from a number of oppressive ailments, was both physically and mentally fit to be the President of the United States. Dr. Williams' opinion, published in an article in the widely circulated Collier's magazine, allayed public doubts about Roosevelt's condition. As a result, Williams was to be offered a newly created post in Roosevelt's cabinet, Secretary of Health. However, it was another 30 years before health became a cabinet post, due to the politicking of Oscar Ewing. The Rockefellers had greatly extended their business interests in the impoverished southern states by establishing the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission. It was headed by Dr. Wycliffe Rose, a longtime Rockefeller henchman whose name appears on the original charter of the Rockefeller Foundation. Despite its philanthropic goals, the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission required financial contributions from each of the 11 southern states in which it operated, resulting in the creation of state departments of health in those states and opening up important new spheres of influence for the drug trust. In Tennessee, the Rockefeller representative was a Dr. Olin West, who moved on to Chicago to become the power behind the scenes at the American Medical Association for 40 years, as secretary and general manager. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research finally dropped the medical research part of its title. Its president, Dr. Detlev Bronk, resided in a $600,000 mansion furnished by this charitable operation. Rockefeller's General Education Board has spent more than $100 million to gain control of the nation's medical schools and turn our physicians to physicians of the allopathic school, dedicated to surgery and the heavy use of drugs. The board, which had developed from the original Peabody Foundation, also spent some $66 million for Negro education. One of the most far-reaching consequences of the General Education Board's political philosophy was achieved with a mere $6 million grant to Columbia University in 1917, to set up the Progressive Lincoln School. From this school descended the National Network of Progressive Educators and Social Scientists, whose pernicious influence closely paralleled the goals of the Communist Party, another favorite recipient of the Rockefeller millions. From its outset, the Lincoln School was described frankly as a revolutionary school for the primary and secondary schools of the entire United States. It immediately discarded all theories of education which were based on formal and well-established disciplines, that is, the McGuffey reader type of education which worked by teaching such subjects as Latin and algebra, thus teaching children to think logically about problems. Rockefeller biographer Jules Abel hails the Lincoln School as a beacon light in progressive education. Rockefeller Institute Financial Fellowships produced many prominent workers in our atomic programs, such as J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was later removed from government laboratories as a suspected Soviet agent. Although most of his friends and associates were known Soviet agents, this was called guilt by association. The Rockefeller Foundation created a number of spin-off groups, which now plagued the nation with a host of ills, one of them being the Social Science Research Council, which single-handedly spawned the nationwide poverty industry, a business which expends some $130 billion a year of taxpayer funds while grossing some $6 billion income for its practitioners. The money, which would amply feed and house all of the nation's poor, is dissipated through a vast administrative network which awards generous concessions to a host of parasitic consultants. Despite years of research, the present writer has been able to merely scratch the surface of the Rockefeller influences listed here. For instance, the huge Burroughs Wellcome drug firm is wholly owned by the charitable Wellcome Trust. This trust is directed by Lord Oliver Franks, a key member of the London Connection which maintains the United States as a British colony. Franks was ambassador to the United States from 1948 to 1952. He is now a director of the Rockefeller Foundation, as its principal representative in England. He also is a director of the Schroeder Bank, which handled Hitler's personal bank account, director of the Rhodes Trust in charge of approving Rhodes scholarships, visiting professor at the University of Chicago and chairman of Lloyds Bank, one of England's Big Five. Other Rockefeller Foundation spin-offs include the influential Washington think tank, the Brookings Institution, the National Bureau of Economic Research, whose findings play a critical role in manipulating the stock market, the Public Administration Clearing House, which indoctrinates the nation's municipal employees, the Council of State Governments, which controls the nation's state legislatures, and the Institute of Pacific Relations, the most notorious communist front in the United States. The Rockefellers appeared as directors of this group, funneling money to it through their financial advisor, Louis Lichtenstein Strauss, of Kuhn, Loeb Company. The Rockefellers have maintained their controlling interest in the Chase Manhattan Bank, owning 5% of the stock. 1% is generally considered to give working control of a bank. Through this one asset, they control $42.5 billion worth of assets. Chase Manhattan interlocks closely with the Big Four insurance companies, of which three, Metropolitan, Equitable and New York Life, had $113 billion in assets in 1969. With the advent of the Reagan administration in 1980, the Rockefeller interests sought to obscure their longtime support of world communism by bringing to Washington a vocally anti-communist administration. Reagan was soon wining and dining Soviet premiers as enthusiastically as had his predecessor Jimmy Carter. The Reagan campaign had been managed by two officials of Bechtel Corporation, its president, George Pratt Schultz, a Standard Oil heir, and his counsel, Caspar Weinberger. Schultz was named Secretary of State, Weinberger, Secretary of Defense. Bechtel had been financed by the Schroeder-Rockefeller Company, the 1936 alliance between the Schroeder Bank and the Rockefeller heirs. The Rockefeller influence also remains preeminent in the monetary field. Since November 1910, when Senator Nelson Aldrich chaired the secret conference at Jekyll Island which gave us the Federal Reserve Act, the Rockefellers have kept us within the sphere of the London connection. During the Carter administration, David Rockefeller generously sent his personal assistant, Paul Volcker, to Washington to head the Federal Reserve Board. Reagan finally replaced him in 1987 with Alan Greenspan, a partner of J.P. Morgan Company. Their influence on our banking system has remained constant through many financial coups on their part, one of the most profitable being the confiscation of privately owned gold from American citizens by Roosevelt's edict. Our citizens had to turn over their gold to the privately Federal Reserve System. The Constitution permits confiscation for purposes of eminent domain, but prohibits confiscation for private gain. The gold's new owners then had the gold revalued from $20 an ounce to $35, giving them an enormous profit. In reviewing the all-pervasive influence of the Rockefellers and their foreign controllers, the Rothschilds, in every aspect of American life, the citizen must ask himself, what can be done? Right can prevail only when the citizen actively seeks justice. Justice can prevail only when each citizen realizes that it is his God-given duty to mete out justice. History has documented all of the crimes of the usurpers of our Constitution. We have learned the painful lesson that the Rockefeller monopolists exercise their evil power almost solely through federal and state agents. At this writing, former Congressman Ron Paul is running for the presidency of the United States on an eminently sensible and practical campaign: abolish the Federal Reserve System, abolish the FBI, abolish the Internal Revenue Service, and abolish the CIA. It has been known for years that 90% of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, ostensibly set up to fight crime, has been to harass and isolate political dissidents, including the present writer, over a period of some 33 years. The criminal syndicalists are now looting the American nation of $1 trillion each year, of which about one-third, more than $300 billion per year, represents the profitable depredations of the drug trust and its medical subsidiaries. Before a sustained effort to combat these depredations can be mounted, Americans must make every effort to regain their health. As Ezra Pound demanded in one of his famous radio broadcasts, "Health, damn it, America became the greatest and most productive nation in the world because we had the healthiest citizens in the world." When the Rockefeller Syndicate began its takeover of our medical profession in 1910, our citizens went into a sharp decline. Today, we suffer from a host of debilitating ailments, both mental and physical, nearly all of which can be traced directly to the operations of the chemical and drug monopoly, and which pose the greatest threat to our continued existence as a nation. Unite now to restore our national health. The result will be the restoration of our national pride, the resumption of our role as the inventors and producers of the modern world, and the custodian of the world's hopes and dreams of liberty and freedom.